Alright guys, welcome back. Now we're going to look at some basic watercolour techniques, and first up is wet on wet. Now this is my favourite watercolour technique. It creates incredible effects. There are a few different ways to do this, so I'm going to go through them one by one in a demonstration. There are lots of different ways to do wet on wet technique. So what I've done is broken them down into some of the different methods. Now I've given each of them a name. That's not their official name, but it just helps me distinguish between the different types. So the first one we're going to do is what I call the touch technique. So we'll mix up some colour here. I'm using a mixture of turquoise and purple because that's what I'm in the mood for today. And we're going to create a circle on the paper like that. And then we're going to rinse off the brush and get ourselves a lighter value. And then paint next to it and simply allow them to touch. And what's going to happen in that area is that the paint from this area is going to move into this area. Now generally when wet on wet happens, the pigment moves from more concentrated to less concentrated, or from darker value to lighter value. We can also use this technique to shift colour. So if we start with a purple, like that, and then we shift into more of a turquoise colour. I'll do it a slightly lighter value so you can see it working. And we simply just touch one area next to the other. And you can see it starting to bleed in. Now it's very important not to mess around with this with your brush, to go in and start poking it or pulling it or dragging it. Trust that the pigment will move and let it do its own thing naturally, and you're much more likely to end up with a smooth bleed and to end up with an even finish. Now the second technique is very similar, and it's what I'm going to call the flood technique, and that is using more water content in the second shape to try and push the pigment back from light to dark. So it's essentially this but the opposite. For this technique to work, you'll need a slightly drier mixture or a less wet mixture because we want to use more water in the second shape. So here's a simple purple shape, and then if I add a much wetter, lighter colour, not too wet, we don't want to completely create puddles, but a wetter one, and it then goes into the previous shape. And can you see how it sort of lifts the pigment off the paper? The flood technique moves that pigment and it creates this nice white spidery effect. You have to let it dry completely and try not to go in there with so much water that you create a pool. Okay, you can see that this part of the shape is still wet, and so we're not going to create too many hard edges. So this is the flood technique. The third wet on wet technique is what I'm going to call the drop in technique. So this involves creating a shape or an area of paint, and then we are going to find a darker value mix with more pigment and simply drop it in. You can do this in shapes, you can do it in lines, and because this pigment is wet and that paint is wet, all of this will spread and blend together and create really good contrast. This is a really common technique for loose florals because you can create a leaf or a petal, and then you can find a stronger pigment and drop it in and just let it spread back through the shape. The final wet on wet technique we're going to look at is called the paper soak. So this involves using just water to wet your paper first, like that, and then we're simply going to get some paint and drop it into that area. So pick up some of this colour, maybe a bit more turquoise, more purple, and then we are going to just drop it in there on an already wet area of paper. So it's not dropping it into another colour, it's doing it against the white of the paper. And when this dries, the bit that hasn't got paint on it will dry clear and it will look like you haven't painted on it. you can keep adding more colours to this. You can add different colours or darker colours. You can also change this technique by having more or less water on your brush when you add the second colour. So if you have, say, quite a bit of water and put it in, it will spread very quickly and very far. But if you have quite a dry brush, if you just pick up a bit of colour, tap it off on a kitchen towel there and then put in a dry bit, you will see that it's much darker and it doesn't spread as far. So you can control how far this goes depending on whether your colour is more pigmented or with more water. Those are the main 4 techniques for wet on wet painting. If you want to play around with those, experiment and see what you can do with different amounts of water content, different colours, and just have fun with it. The second technique we're going to look at is wet on dry. So this is different to wet on wet because we allow the first layer of the paint to dry before painting over the top of it. And I'm going to show you some different ways we can do this. Okay, so when we think about wet on dry, there are essentially 3 ways to use this. Now you can see I've prepared a couple of bits here. For the first technique, we're going to talk about building. So building is simply adding more colour on top of an already dry colour to create a darker value. So you can see here we just add another layer. Now it's really important that the first layer is dry before you add the second layer, otherwise you'll just get a wet on wet technique. The most common way to paint with watercolours is to work from light to dark. So you essentially have your light colour first and you let it dry, and then you paint on a medium value. And then when that's dry, you paint over the top of that for the darkest value, and that's how you build your 3 values. So if you find that your piece, when you're finished with it, doesn't have a lot of contrast, then the best way to do that is to layer with this building technique. The second wet on dry technique we'll talk about is glazing, and glazing is a technique to make the most of how transparent watercolours are. So in glazing, what we do is we take a light value and we create, let's say, some stripes here, and maybe a little third one there. And then we allow these to dry, and then we come back over and we paint more different colours over the top. Once these have dried, what you can do is add a different colour in a glaze over the top. So let's mix up a nice light purple value there. And then what happens is that we paint a glaze over the top. And where these colours cross over, they will create a mixture. And what you can do is build this up again with some pinks and some greens and create lots of different variations by simply glazing. So each colour is slightly transparent and it shows a bit of the colour underneath. Again, it's really important that the bottom layers have dried completely before you move on to the next layers. One of the ways that I like to speed up drying, if you're very impatient, you can use a hairdryer on a low setting. You need to make sure that you don't blow the water in any direction. You need to hold it vertically above the paper. You need it on a low heat setting, and you need to keep it moving so that it dries evenly instead of drying a patch here and a patch there. So low setting, vertical hold, and move it across the paper. Another technique is called layering. Now you'll see that I've pre-prepared these circles, and what happens with layering is that we create dimension and depth in a piece of paper by using darker colours to show that things are further forward and lighter colours to show that things are further back. So if we layer a darker circle over these, it will give the illusion that the dark circle is in front of them and the lighter circles are at the back, they're further behind. So it helps us create some depth. And we can create another one here. And then if we let this dry and paint a darker circle again over the top, or even one over here, it's going to appear that there are 3 levels of circles. This is a good technique for adding depth to any of your work. The third technique we're going to look at is blending and gradients. So this is about creating transitions from one colour to the next. This involves making a transition of some kind in your colours. Now a single colour gradient involves taking one colour and starting off with a darker section here and then moving into a lighter section by lightening the value. And it should create a smooth transition. And what you can do is go back over the join and smooth that out to create a really smooth transition, and we can do that again even lighter at the end. This is the easiest way to create a gradient. You can also do it with the wet on wet technique we looked at, where you add the water first and then you add the pigment second and you just let it smooth. And then you can simply smooth it out with your brush. If you create any puddles like that, you can just tap it off and come back in. It's important that all of the stages of the gradient have the same water content and that the top bit doesn't dry before you finish with the bottom bit, or you're going to end up with lines and patches. Okay, the second gradient technique is using two colours. And the idea is to create a smooth transition from the first colour to the second colour. So in this example, we'll use a purple. And the easiest way to do this is to start with a darker value and then slightly lighten it with water for the transition. And then take your second colour, start at the other end, and then add a lighter colour for the transition. And what you can do then is take a clean brush and then smooth over the area in the middle just to create a smooth transition. Another technique to do this is to use a large amount of water and tip the paper slightly. So for example, if we mix up a really wet top colour there, and then what we're going to do is lift the paper up so that we get a puddle along this bottom edge, and then you can change your colour to purple and pull that through, and then we can add more purple and create a transition that way. And can you see how it just follows the gravity along the paper to create a nice smooth transition? So that's how to create gradients.